The ache had been riding him since before first light, a low, stubborn throb that seemed to live somewhere deep inside his body, not sharp enough to stop him but steady enough to wear him down. Ezra Cole woke with it pressing against his awareness like an unwelcome thought. He lay still on the narrow bed, listening to the wind scrape along the side of the ranch house and the faint creak of the beams overhead. For a moment, he considered staying there, staring at the ceiling, letting the day begin without him. The idea passed as quickly as it came. The ranch didn't wait, neither did cattle, nor weather, nor fences that had a habit of falling apart when you least needed the trouble. He swung his legs down and felt it again, stronger now, a pull low in his body that made him draw a sharp breath through his teeth. Ezra stood slowly, hands braced on his thighs, eyes shut until the room stopped tilting. "Just age," he muttered, the words more ritual than belief. He'd said them for months. Maybe longer. Age, long rides, cold nights, bad sleep. Ranchers learned early how to name pain in ways that made it smaller. Outside, the morning was pale and cold. Frost silvered the ground, crunching under his boots as he crossed the yard. The sky was wide and undecided, streaked with thin clouds that looked like they might either burn off or turn ugly by afternoon. His horse, Boone, lifted his head from the rail and snorted softly, breath puffing white. Ezra rested his forehead briefly against the horse's neck, letting the solid warmth steady him. The ride out to the north pasture was familiar enough that he could have done it with his eyes closed. Boone knew the way, stepping around stones and shallow dips without needing the reins. Ezra shifted in the saddle, trying to find a position that didn't send a dull spike through him. The ache followed anyway, like it had settled in for the long haul. He focused on the work ahead, counting cattle, checking the fence line where the creek cut close and liked to undermine posts after a hard rain. Cattle moved slow and dark against the grass, heads down, tails flicking. Ezra counted them out of habit, even though he already knew the number. He'd known it for years. Numbers were steady things. They didn't change unless something went wrong. Pain, on the other hand, had a way of changing when you weren't looking. When he dismounted to check the fence, swinging his leg over the saddle sent a sharper jolt through him. His breath caught, and for a second his vision went bright around the edges. He landed heavier than he meant to, boots slipping slightly on the frosted ground. Boone shifted and stamped, sensing the tension. "Easy," Ezra murmured, more to himself than the horse. He walked along the fence, running a practiced hand over the wire, checking tension, posts, staples. One of the posts near the creek leaned at an angle that wasn't right. Ezra grabbed it and pushed, testing how loose it was. The pain flared hard, sudden and deep, enough that he had to let go and grab the rail instead. The world narrowed to the feel of cold wood under his palms and the sound of blood rushing in his ears. He bent forward, shoulders rising and falling as he breathed through it. The ache pulsed now, no longer content to sit quietly. It demanded attention. Ezra closed his eyes and waited for it to ease, jaw clenched so tight it hurt in its own way. When he straightened, his hands were trembling. There was no one to hear him but the cattle and the wind, and maybe that was why the words finally came. "I've been aching down there." Saying it out loud made it real in a way he'd been avoiding. The land didn't answer, but it didn't judge either. It just lay there, vast and indifferent, the way it always had. He tipped his head back and looked up at the sky. It was brighter now, the sun thinning the clouds, light spilling through in pale bands. He squinted against it, feeling suddenly small beneath all that space. He'd spent his whole life under open skies, trusting them to do what they'd do whether he liked it or not. Rain came, drought came, storms tore through and left what they left. You adjusted, you endured. His father's face surfaced in his mind without warning, weathered and lined, eyes always measuring something beyond what was right in front of him. "Pain's a message," his father used to say. "Problem is, most men don't listen until it's shouting." Ezra had laughed at that once, young and strong and convinced his body would always do what he told it. The memory tasted bitter now. He thought of the years stacked behind him like fence posts stretching back to the horizon, days that began before sunrise and ended well after dark, seasons of drought and flood, blizzards and heat so thick it felt like breathing through cloth. He thought of the times he'd been hurt before. Broken ribs from a spooked horse, a hand crushed in a gate, a fever he'd worked straight through until he collapsed in the yard. He'd always come back. That had become part of his identity. Ezra Cole didn't stop, didn't rest, didn't complain. But this ache felt different. Not like something you could tape up or walk off. It felt rooted, like it had grown there quietly while he was busy proving he didn't need help. He shifted his weight and felt it again, an insistent reminder that whatever it was hadn't gone away just because he'd ignored it. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of water from the creek and the faint, familiar scent of cattle. Boone flicked an ear and snorted, tugging lightly at the reins. Ezra reached out and stroked the horse's neck, grounding himself in the simple, solid reality of muscle and hide and warmth. He thought of the ranch house, of the empty rooms that echoed at night. Of meals eaten standing up, of conversations that never happened because there was always another chore, another fence, another reason not to stop. He thought of the hands who relied on him, the quiet way they looked to him before making decisions, trusting his judgment because it had never failed them. If this ache meant something was wrong, really wrong, then pretending otherwise wasn't strength. It was risk, not just to him, but to everything he was responsible for. The thought settled heavy in his chest. Ezra stood there longer than he realized, eyes still on the sky, until the cold began to creep through his coat and into his bones. The light had shifted, clouds moving on like slow cattle driven by an unseen hand. Time, he knew, didn't pause for contemplation. It moved whether you were ready or not. He let out a long breath and squared his shoulders. The decision forming inside him felt strange, almost foreign, like trying to write with his other hand. He didn't know exactly what he'd do yet, only that continuing as if nothing was wrong was no longer an option. That realization carried its own kind of ache. Ezra picked up his tools and reset the post as best he could for the moment, movements slower, more deliberate. Each step was measured now, not from weakness but from attention. When he mounted Boone again, he did it carefully, testing his weight, adjusting until he found a position that didn't send pain shooting through him. The horse started forward at a steady walk. As they rode back along the fence line, Ezra kept his gaze forward, jaw set, mind working. Pride had kept him silent. Habit had kept him moving. But under the wide, indifferent sky, with the land stretching out in all directions, he finally allowed himself to consider something else, that listening to his body might be the hardest work he'd ever done. The ache was still there as he rode, a constant presence, but now it felt different, not just like an enemy, but like a warning sign he'd finally chosen to read. And as the ranch rolled by on either side of him, familiar and vast, Ezra knew that whatever came next would change things. He didn't know how yet. He only knew he couldn't keep pretending nothing was wrong. By the time Ezra reached town, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the dust off the road, though it did nothing to ease the tightness coiled inside him. The ride in felt longer than it ever had, every mile marked by the ache he could no longer ignore. Boone sensed the difference, keeping a steady, careful pace as if he understood that today wasn't about speed or stubbornness. Town appeared the way it always did, rising from the plain in a cluster of weathered buildings and hitching posts, a place born out of necessity rather than comfort. Ezra slowed as he passed the feed store, the saloon, the bank. Familiar faces turned toward him, some lifting hands in greeting, others simply watching. He realized then how rare it was for him to ride in without a load of supplies or a clear purpose everyone could see. Today, his purpose was invisible, and that made him feel exposed. He reined Boone to a stop in front of the doctor's office, a modest building with a faded sign and windows that reflected the sky. Ezra sat in the saddle longer than he meant to, staring at the door. It wasn't fear exactly that held him there, but a lifetime of habit whispering that whatever waited on the other side could be avoided if he just rode away. He swung down anyway. The hitching post creaked as he tied Boone, his hands slower than usual. Each movement sent small reminders through him, little sparks of discomfort that added up to something heavier. He straightened his coat, squared his shoulders, and pushed through the door. The office smelled of antiseptic and old wood. It was quiet except for the ticking of a clock on the wall, each second landing loud in the stillness. The doctor looked up from behind a desk, surprise flickering briefly across his face before settling into something more neutral. "Ezra Cole," the man said. "Haven't seen you in a long while." "Wasn't sure I ever would," Ezra replied, his voice rougher than he intended. The doctor gestured to a chair. Ezra sat, stiffly, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. He wasn't used to explaining himself, least of all to someone whose job was to look closely and ask questions. When the doctor finally asked what brought him in, Ezra didn't soften it or dress it up. He spoke plainly, choosing honesty over pride for once. The words came slow at first, then steadier, like water finding its course. He talked about the ache, how long it had been there, how it had changed. He admitted the things he'd ignored, the days he'd pushed through when he shouldn't have. The doctor listened without interruption, nodding now and then, eyes thoughtful. There was no judgment in his expression, no hint of the, "I told you so," Ezra half expected. That alone eased something in him. The examination took time. Tests followed, questions, more waiting. Ezra lay on a narrow table staring at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the plaster with his eyes. The clock ticked on, steady and relentless. For the first time in years, he was doing nothing but waiting, and it felt strangely exhausting. When the doctor finally returned, his expression was serious but not grim. He spoke carefully, explaining what he'd found, what it meant, what needed to happen next. Trouble, yes, but not beyond managing. Not if Ezra was willing to change a few things, to rest when rest was needed, to accept help. Ezra listened, absorbing every word. Relief came first, thin and tentative. Then something heavier followed. The understanding that relief didn't mean things would go back to the way they were. It meant they would go forward differently. He nodded once, slowly. "I can do what needs doing," he said. "I believe you can," the doctor replied. "But you can't do it alone." That was the part that lodged in Ezra's chest. Outside, the light had shifted again, afternoon settling in. Ezra mounted Boone and rode not back to the ranch, but to the center of town. Word spread quickly, as it always did. By the time he tied up near the general store, a few of his hands had already gathered, concern written plainly across their faces. Ezra didn't waste time easing into it. He stood before them, hat in hand, and told them the truth. Not all of it. Some things were his to carry, but enough. He spoke about the ache, about the doctor, about needing time to heal. The words tasted strange, like speaking a language he'd never learned. The men listened in silence. When he finished, no one laughed, no one looked away. His foreman stepped forward first, meeting Ezra's eyes. "We've got things covered," the man said simply. "That's what we're here for." Something loosened in Ezra's chest at that. He nodded, trusting them in a way he never quite had before. He handed over responsibility piece by piece, naming tasks, setting expectations. The unthinkable wasn't just admitting weakness, it was stepping back and letting others step forward. As the group dispersed, Ezra felt lighter and heavier all at once. Lighter for having spoken, heavier for knowing the weight he'd set down had been real all along. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The ache was still there, but it no longer felt like an enemy lurking in the dark. It was a known thing now, named and acknowledged. The land stretched out before him, familiar and vast, unchanged by his small personal reckoning. At the house, Ezra unsaddled Boone and rubbed the horse down carefully, taking his time. He moved slower, yes, but with intention. Each deliberate motion felt like a promise, to himself more than anyone, that he'd pay attention now. As evening settled, Ezra sat on the porch, boots off, hat beside him. The sky burned orange and pink before fading into cooler shades, stars beginning to prick through. He looked up again, the way he had that morning, searching the same open sky. Nothing dramatic happened. The ache didn't vanish. The ranch didn't transform. But something inside him had shifted, quiet and firm. He'd faced something he couldn't rope or outride, and instead of breaking him, it had forced him to choose differently. Tomorrow would bring its own work, its own challenges. For once, Ezra felt ready to meet them, not by pushing harder, but by listening. And under the wide, steady sky, that felt like its own kind of strength.